Yeah, no, just sort of disappointed weekend with the Middlesbrough game. We had big expectations for that game, after going to Preston and getting such a great result. Really, not many teams go to Preston and win on a Tuesday night, raining as well.
Yeah.
And one of those sort of games that you could quite easily caved in, but we'd done well, very well. But then on the next game, Middlesbrough first game back at home after that sort of result.
When people talk about the Lampard name, the conversation almost always begins with goals, trophies and records. It's usually about Frank Lampard Jr, Chelsea's greatest goal-scoring midfielder, or the Golden Knights under floodlights where the name Lampard echoed around stadiums across Europe. But long before those moments, and long after the applause faded, there was another story unfolding quietly in the background. Frank Lampard Sr lived a life shaped not just by footballing success, but by loss, resilience, and moments of pain that rarely make headlines. His journey is one that mirrors the harsher realities of life beyond the pitch, where strength is tested not by tackles or titles, but by grief, responsibility, and the weight of carrying on when everything feels fragile. Frank Lampard Sr grew up in an era where footballers were expected to be tough, silent, and uncomplaining. Emotion wasn't something openly discussed, especially not among men who made their living in the physical battles of English football. Yet, from a very early age, his life carried a quiet heaviness. At just 5 years old, he lost his father, Frank Richard Lampard, who died in 1953 at only 33 years of age. It's hard to comprehend the impact of such a loss on a child so young, particularly in post-war Britain, where families were already stretched thin and emotional support systems were minimal. For Frank Sr, that early loss shaped everything that followed. It forced maturity too soon and planted a sense of responsibility that never truly left him. Growing up without a father figure meant learning resilience early. There was no safety net, no guiding hand to lean on when things went wrong. Football became both an escape and a proving ground, a place where discipline and routine could replace uncertainty. Those who knew him later often described Frank Lampard Sr as dependable, serious, and deeply loyal, traits that can often be traced back to childhoods where stability had to be built rather than inherited. The absence of his father didn't make him bitter, but it did harden him in a quiet way, instilling a belief that nothing in life was guaranteed and that everything could be taken away without warning. As his playing career developed, Frank Sr established himself as a formidable defender, eventually becoming a West Ham United legend. On the surface, it looked like a story of triumph, a man who overcame early adversity to build a respected footballing legacy. But even during the highs of his career, the shadow of loss lingered. Football gave him identity, but it also demanded sacrifice. Injuries were common, pain was normalised, and long-term health was rarely discussed. That reality came crashing down in April 1968 when Frank Sr suffered a broken leg that threatened to end his career altogether. At a time when medical recovery wasn't as advanced as it is today, such an injury was often a sentence rather than a setback. For over a year, he was sidelined, uncertain if he would ever return to the level required to compete professionally. For someone whose entire sense of purpose was tied to football, the injury was more than physical. It brought fear, doubt, and the possibility that everything he had worked for could simply vanish. The mental toll of those months was immense, yet once again, it was something he carried privately. Eventually, he did return, and not only returned, but cemented his status as a club legend. Still, that period left its mark, reinforcing the idea that stability was always temporary. If you're enjoying these deeper football stories that go beyond the pitch, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps keep these long-form stories alive and reaching more people who appreciate football's human side. Away from football, Frank Sr found his greatest strength in family. His marriage to Patricia "Pat" Lampard became the emotional anchor of his life. Pat wasn't just a partner. She was the stabilising presence behind the scenes, the one who absorbed the pressures that football families often carry silently. Together, they built a home rooted in loyalty and hard work, raising Frank Jr. in an environment where discipline and humility mattered as much as talent. Pat's influence on both father and son was profound, even if it remained largely invisible to the public eye. That stability was shattered in April 2008. Pat Lampard fell ill with pneumonia and was hospitalised. What initially appeared serious but manageable quickly turned catastrophic when she suffered a sudden brain hemorrhage. If you see, 10 days in hospital, she passed away at just 58 years old. The suddenness of her death was devastating. There was no time to prepare, no gradual goodbye, only shock and disbelief. For Frank Sr., losing Pat meant losing the person who had been his emotional constant for decades, the one who had shared every sacrifice and supported every challenge, without ever demanding recognition. The timing made the tragedy even more cruel. Frank Lampard Jr. was in the middle of a Champions League campaign with Chelsea, preparing for a semi-final against Liverpool. Football, which had always been a source of connection for the family, suddenly felt insignificant. Yet in one of the most emotionally charged moments in modern football history, Frank Jr. played that match and scored, dedicating the goal to his mother. The image of him pointing to the sky became iconic, but behind it was a family barely holding itself together. For Frank Sr., watching his son perform under such circumstances was both a source of pride and unimaginable pain. Grief doesn't fade quickly, especially when it's tied to decades of shared life. Frank Sr. withdrew from the public eye after Pat's death, choosing privacy over attention. Those close to him spoke of a man deeply affected, not just by loss, but by the sudden quiet that followed. Football stadiums are loud places, full of noise and movement, but grief is silent. It arrives at night, in empty rooms, in moments where routine no longer makes sense. For someone who had already lost his father at such a young age, losing his wife reopened wounds that had never fully healed. The Lampard family's pain didn't exist in isolation. Pat's twin sister, Sandra Redknapp, also faced serious health struggles, adding another layer of emotional strain to an already grieving family. The extended Lampard-Redknapp circle had long been intertwined through football and family ties, and these shared hardships reinforced how fragile even the strongest bonds can feel when illness and loss strike repeatedly. Professionally, Frank Sr. faced heartbreak as well. After retiring from playing, he became deeply involved in coaching and eventually served as assistant manager at West Ham United for 7 years under Harry Redknapp. It was more than a job, it was home. West Ham wasn't just a club to Frank Sr., it was an identity passed through generations. In May 2001, that chapter ended abruptly when both he and Redknapp were sacked. The dismissal was deeply emotional, not only because of loyalty, but because of what the club represented to the Lampard family. Frank Jr. later described the sacking as a terrible experience, one that fundamentally changed his relationship with the club. Watching his father be dismissed after years of service left a lasting scar. It contributed directly to Frank Jr.'s decision to leave West Ham for Chelsea, a move that reshaped English football history but came at enormous emotional cost. For Frank Sr., the sacking wasn't just professional disappointment. It felt like rejection from a place that had defined his life. Despite everything, Frank Lampard Sr. never allowed bitterness to define him. In later years, he found peace away from the intensity of professional football. By 2019, he had taken over the Nightingale on the Green Pub in Wanstead, a quieter, grounded chapter of life, where community replaced crowds and conversation replaced confrontation. It was a return to something simple, a space where stories could be shared without pressure or expectation. As of 2026, at 77 years old, Frank Lampard Sr. remains a deeply respected figure in English football. His legacy isn't measured only in appearances or trophies, but in resilience. He endured early loss, career-threatening injury, professional rejection, and the devastating death of his wife. yet he carried himself with dignity throughout. His story is a reminder that footballers are shaped as much by what happens away from the pitch as by what happens on it. In many ways, Frank Lampard Sr.'s life explains the mentality of his son better than any statistic ever could. The discipline, emotional control, and relentless professionalism Frank Jr. became known for were forged in a household that understood loss and responsibility intimately. Behind every celebrated football career, there is often an unseen story of sacrifice, grief, and endurance, and few embody that truth more quietly than Frank Lampard Sr. His life stands as a testament to the idea that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply shows up every day, carries on, and refuses to be broken, no matter how heavy the burden becomes. As the years passed, Frank Lampard Sr. became increasingly aware that his role in football history was never meant to be loud or self-promotional. Unlike many former players who chase relevance through media or controversy, he chose a quieter dignity. Those who encountered him in later life often described a man who listened more than he spoke, someone shaped by experiences that taught him the value of restraint. It was the kind of presence that came not from authority, but from having endured. More than most, grief also reshaped his understanding of legacy. After Pat's death, football achievements seemed smaller, fleeting. What mattered more were memories, shared moments, and the unseen support structures that hold families together. Frank Sr. reportedly took comfort in knowing that Pat lived long enough to see their son become one of England's most accomplished footballers, even if she wasn't there to witness the full arc of his career. That knowledge didn't erase the pain, but it gave it context. His relationship with Frank Jr. deepened in quieter ways after 2008. No longer centered around matches and training grounds, their bond became rooted in shared loss and mutual understanding. Frank Sr. understood pressures his son faced at the highest level, while Frank Jr. better understood the sacrifices his father had made without complaint. In many ways, grief stripped away generational distance and replaced it with a deeper, more human connection. There was also a sense of reflection about his own upbringing. Losing his father so young had once felt like an isolated tragedy. But later in life, Frank Sr. began to see patterns across generations. He understood how trauma echoes forward, shaping decisions, attitudes, and emotional defenses. Rather than resenting that reality, he seemed to accept it as part of the Lampard story, one marked by perseverance rather than ease. Even his time at West Ham, once a source of lingering hurt, softened with age. While the sacking never fully stopped hurting, he spoke less about bitterness and more about gratitude for what the club gave him. Time reframed the experience, turning anger into reflection. West Ham wasn't perfect, but it was still where he became who he was. That perspective only comes with distance and maturity. Running a pub in later life may have seemed like a small chapter compared to the grand stages of football, but for Frank Sr., it represented something meaningful. It was a place grounded in routine, familiarity, and conversation, far removed from the volatility of professional sport. In many ways, it was the opposite of football, and perhaps that was exactly why it suited him so well. Patrons who didn't recognise him as a former footballer simply saw a courteous, grounded man behind the bar or in conversation. Those who did recognise him often sensed he wasn't interested in reliving old glories. He carried his past lightly, as something lived rather than something to be displayed. That restraint became one of his defining traits. Looking back, it becomes clear that Frank Lampard Sr.'s greatest contribution to football may not have been tactical or technical, but cultural. He embodied an older generation's values of loyalty, endurance, and quiet professionalism, values that feel increasingly rare in the modern game. His influence wasn't loud, but it was lasting. In a sport obsessed with winners and losers, Frank Sr.'s life reminds us that some of the most important battles are fought away from the pitch. Illness, grief, rejection, and identity are challenges no trophy can solve. His story sits at the intersection of football and real life, where strength is measured by survival rather than silverware. Ultimately, Frank Lampard Sr. represents the unseen backbone of football history. Not the headline maker, not the controversy, but the steady presence who absorbs loss and carries on. His life is a reminder that behind every great football name, there is often a quieter figure whose sacrifices made everything else possible.